Welcome to the London Business School webinar series Beyond the Crisis. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Business School, and I'm your host for this entire series. Today, we're going to be talking about how to make your operation resilient to future shocks, a very topical issue for all of our organizations as we start planning for a life beyond the pandemic. And we have three speakers today. The first is Professor Alex Yang, who's an Associate Professor of Management Science and Operations at the Business School. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, Julian. Thank you for having me.
You are most welcome. Alex is joining us from Hong Kong. Second, we have Michael Davies, who's a guest lecturer at the London Business School, as well as many other things as well. Michael, welcome. Michael's joining us, I believe, from Boston.
Yes, well, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and delighted to be here. 12 hours of time zones behind Alex.
Perfect. Thank you. And third, we have Otti Vogt, who's an alumnus of London Business School and also a senior executive at ING Bank. He's the Chief Operating Officer for the Challenger and Growth Markets for ING. Otti, welcome.
Wonderful to be here, Julian. And I don't know how many time zones we are apart, but it's many. But all the best from Amsterdam.
Perfect. So without any further ado, let me give the floor to Alex, who's going to give us some thoughts on operational resilience. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julian. Let me share my screen. So we're looking at operational resilience. So why do we want operational resilience? For me, operational resilience is really about an organization's capability of managing different risks that could disrupt its operation. So some of those risks are completely out of control of this organization. For example, the current pandemic, we have earthquake, flood, or some other natural disasters. And when we talk about this type of risk, the goal of operational resilience is really about how do organizations quickly recover from it and try to minimize the negative impact. But beyond that, we also have another type of risk, which is something that the organization have control or at least have partial control. This type of risk could be human or process related. Here, I'm listing some of the most recent rock traders. I'm sure Otti knows a lot more about this than me. And we have factory fires that are due to process or human error. We also have technology and system related risks, such as cyber attack, for example. When we look at, of course, this type of risk can be a combination of human, process, and technology factors. If we look at this type of risk, in addition to recover and having try to minimize the negative impact after the risk happens, another part of operational resilience is really about trying to lower the probability that this type of risk will happen at all. So with this, I would like to first launch a quick poll across our audience to get an idea, what type of risks do you think will be mostly costly for your organization? If you can see the poll, please choose. Please feel free to choose more than one if you think that's multiple or relevant. Oh, great. I think we can all see the results now. It's very interesting that, as you can see, the largest, the most popular answer here is actually people and process risk, despite of the fact that we are currently in the middle of a pandemic crisis. And in this case, I tend to agree with our audience that we have a lot of studies that shows the biggest risk that most organizations faces are actually comes from internally human or process related risk. So now we're talking about operational resiliency. I think there are, based on my understanding in this topic and my interaction with different practitioners, there are two common concerns regarding building operational resilience. The first one is whether operational resilience is something that we can build at all, or put differently, is resilience really something, a mission impossible? So actually, if we look back all the way to the 80s, we saw a series of catastrophic disaster or accidents from multiple nuclear plant accidents to the Challenger space shuttle disaster. And by observing and studying some of these events, Charles Perrow, a sociologist from Yale, actually developed this so-called normal accident theory. This theory basically predicts that when we have a system that involves a high complex technology, and tightly coupled processes, accident will be normal. It will be inevitable. If we look at the current global supply chain and operations that most of our organizations are involved in, if we apply Perrow's theory, then that seems to suggest that resilience would be impossible unless we try to completely decouple the system. But personally, my view is more optimistic, and I do think resilience is possible. And many scholars and researchers tend to agree with me on this point. For example, in the late 90s, early late 80s, early 90s, following Perrow's theory of natural accident, a few researchers, mostly from University of California, developed the notion of a high reliability organization. By studying a lot of organizations that actually exhibit exceptional levels of resilience, whether it's some from military, some from civil aviation, some from very complex chemical or nuclear plant, they have summarized 5 common traits that could lead to, they would argue, could lead to a high level of reliability or high resilience for organizations. I'm adopting this photo from the Missouri Hospital Association because this concept has been widely used in the healthcare industry as well. So if we look at some of the traits, they include, for example, deferring to expertise when we try to dig down the root cause of the problem. It involves being very sensitive to operations, and this normally involves the top management of our organization have a very deep understanding of the operations. It involves reluctant to simplify things, which means normally we want to, whenever we see something, we want to dig into the sort of the root cause of the problem. And if we look at certain countries or regions that show that have exhibit resilient performance in dealing with the current pandemic, we can see some of the governments there, exhibit this type of traits to different extent. In fact, if we look at some of those principles or guidelines are also shared and echoed by other well-known management framework. For example, the Toyota Way emphasizes on having on continuous learning and organization learning from past risk or negative events, as well as encouraging everyone in their value chain to speak out when they identify some risk, as well as thinking about trying to find out solutions for the organization. We have the OODA loop. I think Michael is going to talk about it later, and I'll leave it to him. So all in all, I think at a high level, at a strategic level, resilience is possible. And that leads to the second concern that I hear a lot of people talking about when they think about building resilience, which is building resilience it must be very costly. So many people actually have this view that there is explicit trade-off between efficiency and resiliency. In order to build more resiliency, we probably need to sacrifice on the efficiency front. We have to admit that this is partly true, at least partly true, when we think about improving resiliency by adding redundancy. For example, to manage supply risk, we may need to increase our inventory holding. To manage cyber attack, we may need to invest in a backup IT system. And to prevent some human errors, like fat finger errors in the finance industry, maybe we need to add some double check steps to sort of make our process more redundant. So these steps or investments are clearly costly, and they could sacrifice our efficiency. But looking at a lot of recent studies, especially in the operations management area, we actually have developed a lot of quantitative methods and analytics that could help us making redundancy not so costly. Or that is, we can think of we are tilting the efficient frontier so that we only need to sacrifice a little bit of efficiency in order to reach the maximum level of the optimal level of redundancy, so that we can improve our resilience. Now, more importantly, I would argue another matrix or another lever that has not been paid as much as attention to is the dimension of flexibility and agility. In operations management, we conducted a lot of research in this front by looking at, for example, cross-training your workforce in the service sector by building more flexible manufacturing capacity, or by resequencing your production process to make your production process more flexible. And finally, by coordinating multiple functions in the value chain, such as getting signals from sales, trace it back to operations, and all the way to finance. We argue, our research shows that by building this type of flexibility, we can actually improve resilience and efficiency at the same time. And this type of flexibility can be achieved by different means. For example, by better incentivize people, by re-engineering our processes, whether it's manufacturing or service, or by adopting more advanced technology. For example, analytics, or using AR or VR in our human management process to cross-train our workforce. Personally, I have done a lot of research recently in focusing on building operational resilience, mostly by looking at how companies, organizations can best coordinate the physical flow, information flow, and operational flow within the value chain. We find that our research identified that through contract and product innovation, and as well as by using technology to better link operations and finance, for example, through Internet of Things, we can actually achieve a higher resilience level, as well as further unleash the efficient potential of our organization. With this, I'd like to finish my short presentation with a quote from Frederick Smith. Some of you may know him. He's the founding chairman of FedEx. He once famously said, risk management is not a checklist, it's mentality that needs to be top of mind for corporate boards of directors. So with that, I want to highlight the importance of having top management commitment in improving or investing in operational resilience. Of course, probably with complemented by top business school education, for example, from LBS, where we're going to teach about all these very practical methods on operational resilience. I believe operational resilience is something that is achievable and can be achieved in an efficient fashion. And I'm going to stop here and giving back the floor to Julie. Thank you.
Perfect, Alex. Thank you. That's terrific. Yeah, and there's some fascinating issues about the trade-offs and the reconciliation of those trade-offs, which we're going to get back to, of course, in the Q&A. But without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Michael Davies. And I think Michael is going to take a different stab at the phenomenon or the challenge of resilience. Michael, over to you.
Yes, Julian, thank you so much. I'm going to take a different, but I think completely complementary perspective on this one. Alex is looking at operational resilience, which is how you keep doing what you would be doing. I'm going to focus on strategic resilience, and I trust that my slides are sharing.
Yeah.
We have a common understanding of resilience. It's this ability to recover readily from adversity. And given some of the questions that pop up, let me first just make the point that I want to distinguish that from being reliable, which is about being able to do the same sort of thing, or even being robust, which is the ability to take a lot of damage and keep going. We're talking about this ability for something to happen and you to bounce back. What do I mean by strategic? It's this long-term, large-scale perspective. It's this beyond business as normal, beyond what you're currently doing, dealing with significant shifts in your business environment. Why does this matter? Well, my background is in working in the technology sector. And one of the things that has distinguished successful technology companies from those that have fallen by the wayside is their ability to deal with periodic shocks, periodic business and technology shocks. Now, I know that together with natural disasters was lower down in the list of things that people were highlighting in the poll, but that's been my reality for the last 25 years. And if you want some concrete examples of resilience and the ability to cope with it, it's what do you do if you're a smartphone manufacturer, or if you're, in those days, a phone manufacturer, and along comes the Apple iPhone. Well, in fact, I picked the iPhone 3G because that's the point at which you get broadband in the App Store, which completely changed the landscape. And there's a sharp distinction to be made here between my client Samsung, whose response to the advent of the smartphone was very robust, and Nokia, with whom I also worked, whose response was a little bit more fragile. We all know the story of Kodak, failing to adapt effectively to the growth in digital technologies. Much of what got me refocused on this, from working on the tech sector to working on how technology is affecting the broader economy, was watching how Amazon was affecting the retail sector and continues to do with things like the development of AI. Other concrete examples. While things are a little different for them nowadays, what do you do if you're a taxi firm and you're confronted with Uber? What do you do if you're a hotel and you're confronted with Airbnb? And a couple of my favorite examples closer to the state of the art. Perhaps you're an insurance company, and arguably the most successful new entrant into the insurance sector in the United Kingdom is Carrot. Carrot was a telematics company that made black boxes for fleets, and it's now a very successful insurance company. That's the sort of shock that I'm used to people dealing with. And my favorite for all of you, a local firm which makes killer robots. What Franklin Robotics does is little solar-powered robots that kill weeds. And then along comes the third category, one of these natural disasters, something I find myself spending a lot of time thinking and working about, because one of the clients I'm doing a lot of work with is Swiss Re, who write more checks for natural disasters than anybody else. And in fact, have an extremely robust, extremely resilient parametric insurance to deal with other pandemics such as Ebola. Not yet COVID-19. Why else might we need it? Well, I have a particular perspective on this, which is I think that the combination of the way in which digital was changing the landscape in any case, and COVID means that we're looking at what you might characterize as something akin to a shikshalub. And if nothing else from today's seminar you take away, it's how to pronounce that impossible spelling. It's like this: shikshalub. Shikshalub. Shikshalub exterminated 3/4 of all the plant and animal species on Earth, including all these very large-scale lumbering dinosaurs whose size had made them dominant. But it also opened up a whole host of new ecological opportunities. You could argue to some extent that we're having this conversation today because of the rise of mammals, which were small, furry, smart, social, flexible animals who rose as a result of the way in which they responded much more resiliently to the Chicxulub event than anybody else did. And if we look at the world today, as part of preparing for this, I threw together a slide which sort of looked at what has been happening today as a result of this. On the left-hand side of this, you see companies which have gone bankrupt. Some of them relatively obvious: Flybe, Hertz, Avianca, Virgin Australia. Retailers who were suffering in any case because of the impact of technology on what they were doing, and because many of them found themselves in the situation where they were weighed down by a lot of debt and other things, what I've come to think of as corporate comorbidities. People like Uber and Airbnb figuring out how they adapt to this. And then over on the right, companies which are thriving as a result of this shock. Zoom is a little bit in the middle there because while there's been a huge uptake, they haven't done the greatest job at actually putting in place their security to deal with this. So that's presented them with some challenges. But companies that have thrived: Amazon, Slack, Peloton, HelloFresh, the meal delivery company, and it's a US brand, but I'm sure there are counterparts all over the world. King Arthur Flour, because it seems locked at home. We're all turning to baking as a way of doing things. So how do you do this? Well, Alex mentioned the OODA loop. That's about being a fighter pilot. You're already in the dogfight. Observe, orient, decide, act. When it comes to strategic resilience, I've come to think of this as the APDA loop. Anticipate. And the reason I use the word anticipate is because it has 3 related meanings: foresee, take action, and forestall, put in place countermeasures. So it's not just the observe, it's actually be prepared. Prepare, to put in proper conditional readiness, to put things or oneself in readiness, to get ready. So what I want to talk about very briefly is the APDA loop and how that enables you to have strategic resilience to set up the discussion that follows. So when you're trying to anticipate things and you're putting together a strategic plan and a perspective of what you want to go do, I find it very helpful to think of this as a range from a nice, stable world in which there is a clear future and the right thing to do is a single point forecast. In my career, at least, unfortunately, I've never been able to put together a forecast like that. You start at a very minimum with a range of possibilities, with sensitivity analysis and Monte Carlo techniques. And most of the time, you find yourself further over towards the right, thinking about a few discrete scenarios in which the right sort of management tools and approaches are more real options and game theory. If you're all the way over to the right, in the area of true ambiguity, which sometimes happens in the early stages of new technological revolutions, life is challenging. It really requires you to be very good at thinking about what the possible options are and how you're going to adapt and making timely and effective decisions. I'll come on to that, but let me use this to set up a poll. I'm really interested in how you guys all feel who are on this call about the environment. So here's our second poll. What do you think the level of uncertainty is in the environment for your business in particular over the medium term, the next couple of years? So once we're through this first wave of the crisis and we're looking at how it has reshaped the business environment, is it very stable? Is it uncertainty but within a manageable range? Is it a lot of uncertainty but you don't anticipate there being any new shocks? Is it quite a lot of uncertainty and the real possibility of new shocks along these lines? Or are we all the way over on the right in true ambiguity? An interesting distribution. The mode of the I'm very happy for the few of you, the 2%, who see the world as being very stable. Perhaps one of the things that we pick up in the Q&A is which is the particular companies who find that that is the situation for the environment. And I'm very sad and concerned for the 4% who are in the region of true ambiguity. Mine's somewhere between the significant uncertainty and hopefully no new shocks, but I wouldn't rely on that being the case. Let me move forward and talk about ways of adapting. As part of this, there are two techniques in developing strategic plans, forgive me, and your perspective that I have found particularly effective if you're trying to look at. The first is the discipline of systems thinking. Looking beyond your business to think about the supply chain, your complementers, the broader perspective, bringing that perspective to bear, I think is absolutely critical in times like this. And the second one is a long-established, well-known discipline, scenario analysis or scenario planning, in which you look at the relevant ways in which your business could change. The drivers of change, the basic trends, highlight the key uncertainties, look at the interactions amongst them, building on that systems thinking perspective, and develop a set of scenarios which, if nothing else, give you the prepared mind. And for me, early in my career, one of the most telling examples of this was working with a defense company in the 1980s. I'm showing how old I am. And as part of that, we did some work on a very unlikely scenario in 1987, which is, hey, what would happen if the Cold War ended? And it did. And that particular company was much better equipped to respond to what was going on than anybody else because they were prepared. In that particular sense, they had the prepared mind. The prepared mind, I think, is, however, not enough. I'm going to highlight two particular aspects of being prepared, which I believe are critical. The first is you have to build reserves. Don Sol, who's been at LBS and MIT, both of which I teach, has written some really good stuff here about strategy is active waiting. In the environments which I'm used to, you often get this mixture of, from time to time, along comes a golden opportunity or a life and death threat. And what you must have to be able to respond to that is reserves. The second thing that it's extraordinarily helpful to have is what we would call real options. What we mean here is when you're faced with possible scenarios for the future, there's a variety of things you do, whatever is going to happen. You want to create real options, running business experiments, doing things that position you to be able to have a very strong positive payoff in some outcomes, but which the cost is not enormously high. And to try to avoid having to make great big bets. They only work in some scenarios. They have a high cost and negative effect in other cases. So a lot of the work we do is helping people think through how they can turn what would otherwise be a big bet back into a real option so that you can respond more flexibly when the world changes. It's something that working with insurers, for instance, you find them able to conceptualize it well, because you can think of real option as buying a strategic business insurance policy. I've put some money down. In the event that this happens, I'm well equipped to deal with it. Two last key elements. You actually have to make a decision. And what I'm drawing on here is something that many of my students from LBS, I really hope that some of you are here, will recognize from the New Technology Ventures course. The sort of the do's and don'ts about what I've learned about decision-making at board level in technology companies. What are the do's? It's a brutally deadline-driven process. You never get to postpone and procrastinate it because you've got to make a decision now. Make it very rational. Actually make it fun. You've got to approach this. We make better decisions if we're actually having fun. Approach it in a spirit of inquiry, curious about what might happen, rather than advocacy, pursuing a particular point of view. Embrace diversity. Debate and decide stuff. Don't review and approve. It's your responsibility as top and senior management to actually do things. And surprisingly, you make better decisions under uncertainty if you have more data rather than less, and you consider multiple options. And I separated it out because it's counterintuitive to many businesses. Have a fight. Have a good fight. In fact, expressing opinions forcibly and sharing those perspectives has been shown to be really critical to effective decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. And that means you should not try and require consensus. Couple of other don'ts. Don't make it personal. Don't make it political. One of the things the best technology companies are distinguished by is this is not about the individual, and it's not about our power base inside the company. It's about what's best for all of us as a whole. And lastly, actually go do it, act. I've been doing a lot of looking at what I have seen be effective in terms of the leadership behaviors that make the leaders in the digital shift effective. And this is drawn empirically from that. This is sort of grounded research on what we observe are the key characteristics. Well, first is ambidexterity. You don't need to burn down the business. You can continue to exploit the resources built up by the existing core business, while at the same time creating a separate organization to experiment and explore, to create those real options. You need acuity. You've got to start looking outside the business. Get outside the business, get outside your own customers, get outside your investors. Perhaps the best example I know of that, which is widely touted, is the guys at Schneider Electric who have set aside an extra day a week or so for their top management to focus on doing that, because that's what gives you the foresight to anticipate what will happen next. You need that agility. Alex spoke to this. I'm going to echo his sentiment. I'm going to focus on a word, not just agile, but nimble. And you go, what's the difference between agile and nimble? Well, I've come to think of agile as I can move quickly in a given direction. I've come to think of nimble as being the ability to change direction when circumstances warrant. And the last one is have the courage to actually recognize that you're going to have to make a decision. For me, this is one of the most striking. Technology companies make decisions and act because they know that if they don't, they're dead. I've seen many businesses who haven't had to deal with this sort of shift in their environment, both from digital and now from COVID-19, paralyzed at the end of the day, paying lip service and lip sync, but not actually having the courage to make a decision. And that, I think, is the final and most essential characteristic at many levels. It's courage as an organization, it's courage as an individual, it's courage as a manager. You know why? Because actually, although it might impose some costs on the organization, the alternative is worse. So with that, I'll hand back to Julian, who I think is going to set up Otti to bring his perspective to bear on what we had to say.
Thanks, Michael. Terrific stuff. Otti, so you've heard a story about the need for operational resilience. You've heard a complementary story about the importance of strategic resilience. Tell us, from your perspective, you know, you're a senior guy within ING Bank. You have to deal with this stuff on a day-to-day basis, as well as you're starting your planning. How do you think about resilience? What are the practical things that you see happening? What are the things you're trying to change?
Thank you very much, Julian. I mean, wow, what a wealth of experiences and thoughts coming from Alex and Mike there. I've been scribbling as quickly as I could throughout the presentation. I'll try to pick up a few thoughts just to share with you. And I'm very aware that my role as the man without the PowerPoints is probably to bring a little bit of the real life perspective in, but also I think represent a little bit both the alumni and the students of the school. And on that note, I want to start, Julian, thanking you again for all these seminars. And also, I've read that you have been recently admitted to the Academy of Management. So on all our behalf, big congratulations for that. What a wonderful achievement.
Appreciate it.
I wanted to start maybe, Alex, you really caught me. I loved the graph that you had, which showed the difference between redundance and agility. I've been struggling with that in my mind for a while, and that's the best representation I've seen so far. And I think also discussions with Julian's, we've been trying to refine taxonomy a little bit in the space. But what really caught me was the poll that you run. And it resonated with me in as much as I think technology is causing many of the challenges that we find, but it's very seldom the solution of the challenges that we have. I think the people and the process aspect, as the poll showed, are much more prevalent. before I want to offer one different perspective, but before I go there, I wanted to build on Mike's last point in terms of strategic resilience and the aspect of control. So to what degree can you control the future and plan for that? And I think I loved a recent discussion with Justin Hughes, who's another alum of London Business School and an ex-fighter pilot. And he explained it to me, and that whatever you know, you try to standardize in standard operating procedures. And what you don't know, but you know that it could happen, you train for it. So the fighter pilot in the morning looks at the weather forecast and goes through a ritual in terms of the different potential scenarios that could occur during a flight. And then I think there's the big challenge of the unknown unknown, so the famous black swan event. And I think this is where we go into the situation where, in reality, only fast adaptation is going to help us, right? And some level of scenario planning, stretching our courage, building on your point, Mike, and our worldviews as to what could these things be that happen, I think helps with that. I wanted to offer a slightly different slant. So coming at it from that people and also a leadership perspective. And I think in my thinking since I left London Business School, I've been meandering towards a metaphor of an organization more as an organism, as a human being, as opposed to as a machine. And I think that metaphor offers a slightly different lens on the same problem. So if we just put ourselves into the position that we all were at the beginning of the crisis, there was suddenly something happening which we hadn't planned for. And as a reaction to that, there was a lot of anxiety and fear. And I think there is the risk with fear, and I think Mike's point on just act is so important because it triggers very often a freeze reaction. So something is happening in an environment and we don't know what to do. And I think in that regard, what can you do to conquer fear? If you think at it more from a human or an organism perspective, is really about planning for the worst case. So when something happens, you can fall back onto something. And I think to a large degree, the scenario planning at a strategic level, the business continuity planning that Alex talked about at a more operational level, give us that fallback option against the worst case. So we manage our fears because we are somewhat prepared. I think the other aspect from a leadership standpoint here is very important in regards to there are different phases in a crisis. When the event materializes, the unplanned event materializes, we're in a state of, from an ontological perspective, in a state of chaos. And I believe very strongly in that chaos, order has to be reestablished very quickly. So from a leadership perspective, it is really about what Mike has been saying. Reset some rules fast. So you create boundary conditions for a complex adaptive system, using Mike's point, as a leader. So you go out there and you create some boundaries quickly to give people the rails for conquering their fears. And that could be simple things as wash your hands, and then you have detailed videos about how to wash your hands, etc. Or this is what we're going to do in terms of moving people home from the office and things like that. But I think the first hours and hours of chaos in leadership is required to step in. And if you think about anthropology, it's really the archetype of the chief, the protector, that comes into play and is necessary, I believe, in that phase. But I think in the second phase, is the moment that we have reestablished the conditions for operations, it is about enabling a holding environment for continuous adaptation and improvement to be reestablished. And that is actually the archetype of an alchemist or a magician. It is someone who creates a holding environment for the teams to, without fear, express their creativity in regards to reacting to the situation. And you can sense a little bit by the wording that I use. For me, the human being, the person, is really at the center of my leadership world, making absolutely sure that we understand what is happening in the team, in the individual, and in the organization at large. And I'm a very strong believer that more and more leaders have to become a little bit psychologists. They have to be able to sense the system, and then based on the energies in the system, take the right measures to make sure that any anxiety that exists in the wider system is being nudged towards the purpose of the system, because otherwise what we know from psychology and sociology is that the anxiety that is naturally there will express itself in other ways. And most of these other ways are not conducive to the success of the system. And I think in terms of the second phase, what helps is having purpose. Because the problem is we are faced with uncertainty and we need to make decisions. And what is the North Star for our decision-making at that point? having clarity as to what your purpose is. And I think from the banking perspective, at least I can speak for the organization I represent, is our purpose has always been about enabling our people and our customers in the best possible way that we could. Right? So, and you've seen some other organizations who were very compassionate in the way that they started to embrace their people and their customers. And that gives you like the guiding light for the decision making, which I think in a time where you have to act very fast is very, very important. And I think also, again, going back to the point of fear, maybe, based on our understanding, what people require in order to be fully flourishing and motivated to achieve their goals are a number of basic human needs. The first one is for orientation. So in a crisis situation, very quickly, you need to reestablish the roles and the rules so people are clear where to go. The second is a sense of belonging, and this has been very much in our minds with physical distancing to reestablish the networks of care and the interdependencies between all the players. And also picking up on Mike's point, from an information flow perspective, what we always say is one success measure for an agile organization is how fast bad news travel. And that is reliant on the trust, the psychological safety that is installed in those relationships. And I'm very proud to say that ING, as a very agile organization, and I think many others as well, have coped with this crisis very well. In the context of all the human tragedy that has occurred, etc., but from an operational resilience perspective, because that psychological safety, those strong relationships, the transparency of information, and very often radical delegation had already been established. Because one of the other things we have experienced is while it's the guidelines, so the boundary conditions had to be global, so we as an organization could march into a common direction, very often the action had to be local within those global guidelines. Right, and again, so the information flows we've experienced were very important at a local level, but also in terms of lessons learned and continuously cross-fertilizing new ideas across the entire 50,000 plus employee base that we've had. And so sense of belonging and in relation to that, the ability to self-organize. Autonomy is the next one. So very often people find themselves at home, not necessarily with the tools and the skills to become autonomous again. So here again, in order to not only safeguard productivity, but also give people the feeling that they are able to react to this crisis, reestablishing autonomy has been very, very important. And lastly, self-esteem. And there are many, many detractors to self-esteem in this crisis that we had to mitigate. Right, with people being very, very vulnerable or having infected people in the family, et cetera, et cetera. So there were many, many ways that leaders had to take care of that. And I think we have all become we've become much more experts in terms of how fear works on human beings and how a pandemic creates fear, also very often where there is no physical fear involved. So some people talk about an epidemic of fear. And I think that is very accurate. And finally, one point in terms of the resilience and the agility of the organization is fairness. Something that we know from psychology, again, is a hygiene factor. If fairness is there, it doesn't help a lot to improve the resilience of the organization. But if it is absent, it becomes the main detractor. And here, just think about, we have a huge branch network in some countries, and then the selection as to who works from the branch, potentially exposing themselves to the risk of infection vis-a-vis who is not working from the branch, right? So there are many fairness impacting decisions to be made in a situation like this, right? Which I think is quite interesting.
Thank you. I'm gonna pause you there, Otti, if that's okay, because I've got a lot of questions. And so I think it's fascinating to see you play up the whole kind of human side of the coin. So, you know, this wasn't completely planned, but operational resilience is about making the operations, you know, able to withstand shocks. Michael talked about strategic resilience, and now Otti, you've been talking about the behavioural or personal aspects of resilience, and these are all complementary. So, look, too many questions to possibly cover in the next kind of 13 minutes, but let me start with Alex. This is a big question, so I guess all three of you are going to have a quick shot at. Please keep your answers fairly short. Alex, you talked about the Toyota production system. You touched on it. We do all know that the Toyota production system is about lean. It's about deliberately building quality in partly by sort of deliberately taking other things out. If you take out inventory, you take out waste, you create products which are better. But of course, by definition, the more you squeeze those things out, the risk is that, of course, what you do is you actually make the system a little bit more fragile. You talked a little bit about reconciling these tensions, but how far can you really take that? Or let me ask the question slightly differently. Does the Toyota production system, in its focus on lean, actually also build in resilience? And Alex, you talk to that first, and then Otti, I know you've got some points of view on that. We'll go to Michael afterwards.
Thank you, Julian. Lean manufacturing is an important factor of Toyota. I would argue on the lean part, by eliminating inventory, you make the system a lot more responsive to possible shocks. Once the external environment changes, the system is more responsive. But the other part of the Toyota production system is actually also about respect for people, which actually encourages people, employees, or even their suppliers to go out of their way to find solutions to be resilient, normally to be fast, and so that there are some good stories about how Toyota managed a certain crisis very fast.
So there are some underlying capabilities, and that was one of the questions actually, that are common across, if you like, agility and resilience. Otti, what's your view? I mean, you know the world of agile software development very well, for example, and I've written in the past that sometimes there's a risk that agile is fragile. In other words, if we develop software in a very agile way, there's a risk that we don't build enough resilience into it. Otti, what's your response to that?
I think there is tension, I would argue, but again, I refer to Alex because Alex is much more knowledgeable on the logistics chains, etc. I think I see a tension there. I also see an underlying capability that is about continuous improvement. It's customer centric in the way that we work in a lean type of setup, and it's people centric as well. So I think there are some underlying capabilities that we can leverage. If I look at agile, I think that is even more the case, particularly in the more mature agile enterprise implementation, where we are really trying to maximize the flexibility that is part of the overall model. I think where I'm coming in, I'm going back to Mike's point on ambidextrous. I think in reality, you need to have both capabilities. You need to be able to continuously exploit the existing and explore the new. And I think this is where sometimes you need different containers for these different practices. And same, and that was my last time quickly, on the crisis management, there are different phases. There's the initial response, there's the one where you continue to optimize within the crisis setup, and then you go back to a new normal. And there are kindly different focuses and people involved in these different phases. And I think that adds to our resilience if we're able to manage these holistically, but in slightly different ways.
Got it.
Julian,
any additional points?
Yeah, two, and they're sort of slightly complementary. I focus just as much on the Toyota design system, which is not as widely known or as well understood. One of the things that is characteristic about it, and also very counterintuitive, is during the design process for a new vehicle, Toyota keeps its options open for possible designs much later in the process than most companies. And that seems that like you're imposing additional costs because you're pursuing multiple paths in parallel before you make a final choice. The reality is they've accepted that you're not going to have full information until later in the process. And that process of keeping their options open, which by the way, is also reflected in the way that great smartphone manufacturers work, is really quite different from the right at the beginning, I'm going to make a decision and then try and play it out. So they are very nimble and then they freeze and move quickly. Yep. And to the explore exploit, when they came to do the Prius, they recognized that the way that they were going to try and enter this new sector, the way they were organized to do their mainstream Corolla, Avalon, Camry cars, was just not well equipped to a different architecture. They built a completely new division with a highly adaptive, decentralized people, and staffed it with, to Otti's point, people who were seen somewhat as mavericks in the organization. So completely different question. It's actually to something that Michael said around
as we try to prepare for uncertain future, we build real options. And this is a point that's bugged me for years. And in some ways, it may go to Otti first, because it's anybody can make a case that any investment is an option. In other words, the beautiful thing about an option is that it sounds like it's something that's relatively cheap, and that it gives us opportunities for doing things in the future which may or may not pan out. So, Otti, what's your practical experience of how you actually figure out when certain options are not worth investing in? Have you had to do that? I mean, I'll come back.
You mean in terms of potential necessary crisis mitigation options? Is that?
No, I mean, building options for the future. I want to invest in this project because this is something I think is going to give us a real opportunity in the future.
I love that question also. I think it relates a little bit to this notion of build back better, because I think with also the macroeconomic level, the money that we're investing to mitigate the crisis, we should and we must not lose the opportunity to build back better. And I think from my experience, what we've seen, we're investing about 1.4 billion euros every year in investments. And of course, throughout this period, we have looked very hard at all the investments we're making to make sure that we have a clear prioritization, both in terms of where necessary adjusting to shortages in terms of supply, or the necessity to mitigate the cost structure. And I think Mike mentioned this, or indeed to accelerate certain things, right? So here, what has guided us is, again, I think, our view of the future, and that is very much digital. So we are trying to accelerate things that will allow our customers to do most of their operations digitally, with the belief that some of this behavior to not go to branches will stick. That is one example. If
Thanks.
That helps.
Michael, how can I?
Sure, let me just pick up on that.
Go on.
Sorry, the point about real options is you create them, but you kill them. And the discipline here is having a sufficiently broad portfolio, running the experiments, and then taking the ones that aren't working and having the brutal, deadline-driven, do you know what, this isn't just working, kill it. And I want to put that emphasis on this because it's something that's well understood in the technology community, that you create every startup you can think of. VCs only see you, if you're doing a startup, as a real option that they're buying. And that's why they are so brutal and disciplined about killing real options that are no longer in the money. If it ain't in the money, kill it and redistribute the resources. So the mirror here is create the options, but boy, you've got to kill the ones that need killing.
I love that point, Mike, if I can say that. You triggered me, indeed. And that is very often a very difficult part. So I think there's the adaptation, Julian, in terms of we start with an MVP and we develop further, and there's modification in the way that we go on developing in an agile system. Yet at the same time, there needs to be the hard facts around the business case. Does it still stand up? Is it still worth continuing? And indeed, Mike makes an excellent point. Very often that cutting it is what is very hard.
Indeed. And that's
a quote from a friend at Nokia who said, "We have to go on a puppy killing party."
Okay, right. I'm not going to comment on the killing of puppies. That seems unnecessarily cruel. But Alex, we're running out of time. Alex, a quick question for you. Someone says, should we, when talking about resilience, separate out the depth of resilience and the speed of resilience? Is that a distinction you make when you talk about operational resilience?
Not at the level that we define resilience, but in terms of different assessment, we do have a lot of metrics that quantify resilience. For example, about length, we normally look at time to recover. And if we look at depth, normally, for example, revenue impact, the relevant metrics, I would argue, is revenue at risk. So those are the common measures that we use when we manage disruption, which the probability of happening is difficult to estimate.
Got it. Look, we are almost out of time. I've got a very short question to Michael. You've got 30 seconds to answer it. You talked of the APTA loop, or which is like the OODA loop. How often should you go around that loop?
Good question. Many sectors have a cadence that works. In consumer electronics, it's 1 or 2 years. In cars, it's a little bit longer. But it should also, that loop and going back around the loop should be triggered in addition by any new event. So if there's a disruption, that triggers you back into the, okay, all plans are up for grabs, we need to reconsider. And not just a pandemic. a product launch, a competitive entries, a technology announcement, having the discipline to say, do you know what? Add a cycle. So this is not a regular annual planning cycle. It is issue and event driven.
Got it. Okay, look, we are going to finish up. Sarah, if you could bring up the final slide before I say my thanks to all our panelists. For those of you who want to attend more of these seminars, webinars, we have next week, we have a session with Gary Hamill, Professor Gary Hamill, who is well known, I hope, to most of you. He's probably one of London Business School's best known professors. He's going to be talking about humanocracy, which is linked to the title of his new book, Creating Organizations as Amazing as the People Inside Them. So this isn't specific to the pandemic situation, but it's very much a lively issue around how we make our organizations work for the future, whatever the future holds. So that will be on Tuesday. Note the extra late time. Gary is in California, so this one will be at 4 p.m. London time, and you can obviously do your own calculations for wherever you are. And of course, it will be recorded for those in Asia. Notice on that slide also, we've got a couple of URLs. The first one actually applies to all of the webinars that we're offering next week as part of our alumni reunion week. So there's more information there than you need, but there are a whole series of webinars, of which Gary Hamill's is one, which will be available next week for you to sign up to. And as always, they will be free to alumni and indeed everybody else as well. So we're going to finish there. I'd just like to say, finally, a quick thanks to the three panelists, to Alex, to Michael, and to Otti for sharing their wisdom on this fascinating issue of operational resilience. And thank you, the audience, for listening. And we will see you again, hopefully, next Tuesday at 4 p.m. London time. Thank you.